Ladies and gentlemen, our next speaker, how the cyber threat landscape is becoming more complex than ever before. And our speaker for today is the Deputy Chief Analyst, Mandiant Intelligence at Google Cloud Securities. Put your hand together for Luke McNamara.
Good afternoon. Well, my name is Luke McNamara. I work at Mandiant Intelligence, and today I picked a somewhat maybe provocative title, which is about how the cyber threat landscape is becoming more complex than ever before. And the reason I picked this is, over the years going to security conferences like this one, inevitably there would be a presentation or two or three in which you would hear the presenters come up and talk about how the threat landscape that organizations face is becoming more varied and more complex. And I think maybe in part working in the cyber threat intelligence part of cybersecurity, where our job is to track evolving and emerging cyber threats, I think it's a little bit harder to be impressed by notable changes in the environment. Certainly, the cyber threats that we've faced for years are complex from the standpoint of the capability. But what really is maybe unique about the environment we're in? What really, when we look at the actual landscape, could we say makes up a more complex threat environment than we faced in the past? So today I'm going to try to make that case because I think what we've witnessed over the last year or two is a notable shift in the complexity of the types of threats we face. And so I want to start with this, assuming the question, and say, okay, if we assume that the threat environment that organizations face across the globe is becoming more complex today, what is driving that? What is making the current environment different than previous years? I think it's useful to kind of start this by looking back at the past year. And in a lot of conversations with customers, there were really kind of three big macro themes that I would highlight that were shaping what we saw in the past. The first, and probably no surprise, is the record level expansion of multifaceted extortion. So not just the ransomware that we've been seeing for years, but increasingly data theft that actors in this space, criminal actors for the most part, are using to extort organizations. And this is something, unfortunately, even into this year, we are seeing continue upwards. More data being posted to data leak sites as threat actors continue this very lucrative means of cyber threat activity. The other sort of larger macro trend that I would talk about is the continued growth in zero-day exploitation. So more threat actors, again, varied across both the nation-state APT side, as well as financially motivated threat actors, contributing to this problem of zero days being discovered in products and devices. And then lastly, and I think this is really where this starts to tie together in today's topic, we are witnessing a greater focus by threat actors from a variety of different motivations that are focused on evasion of detection. Now, certainly, no threat actor wants to get caught. Different threat actors also care about counter-attribution efforts if they are caught. But what we are witnessing today, in a variety of different subtle and notable ways, is efforts taken by threat actors to increase the difficulty for network defenders to detect their operations. And I would say to the opening question, what really is making the landscape more complex? It's two things, and that's what I want to talk about today in the short time I have you here. It's the expansion and diversity of the threat activity we see, and it's the blurred lines amongst the threat actors that are conducting this activity. So again, looking back last year, and this is from some data that at Mandiant we gather from doing breach response every year, seeing how threat actors break in. Something we track as initial infection vector, right? Or how did the threat actors break in? What we saw is for at least the second year in a row, exploits being the most common way that threat actors broke into organizations, followed by phishing, prior compromise, and stolen credentials. These different categories move up and down in a given year, but one thing in particular I'd call out are things that we've started to see more of in a very small way, but a noticeable way, and that's techniques such as SIM swapping, SMS-based phishing, phishing over LinkedIn. So now, you no longer just have to worry about patch prioritization, patching those exploits that are being actively used by threat actors, not just the phishing that organizations have built up mechanisms with training and different security technologies to address, But now you have these other methods to break into organizations that are becoming more prevalent, right? And these are things that typically live outside the security organization's purview in terms of detection, right? Using phishing over LinkedIn or SMS-based, right? Moving on to the larger ecosystem, in that first category I talked about with extortion. One of the things that we've been seeing in the sort of extortion space, again with the ransomware brands and families, it's really a category, it's really an ecosystem of actors, right? So it's not just thinking about these as groups, but these are an ecosystem of different players and personas and actors that are very fluid. So as we've seen law enforcement disruptions and takedowns, threat actors that may have been working to provide initial access to a certain category of threat actors who are working with ransomware developers, well, all these players might move around and shift. They may work with a different brand of ransomware, right? And so it's a very dynamic environment, one which has shown a lot of resilience over the last several years and continues to evolve. I want to kind of hone in, though, on a piece of what is driving this. And you'll notice back when I talked about ways that threat actors are breaking in, one of the things we see is stolen credentials. One of kind of the subplots to this larger story is how info-stealer malware is shaping or reshaping the threat landscape and how it's contributing to more threat exposure than ever before. So you think of some of these different info-stealer malware names, you may have heard of them before. It's really shaping how organizations have to think about exposure of credentials, right? Because oftentimes we are finding now in responding to breaches is that this malware may have been deployed on an employee's personal laptop that they also used for corporate work. And those credentials that they were using, maybe for personal accounts, were also being leveraged, those passwords, for corporate activity. And so those credentials, when they are captured, and we're seeing increased interest in underground markets to obtain credentials like this, can then be leveraged by the first part of that ransomware ecosystem, the initial access providers. I think one great example of this that kind of showcases, because it's not a very sophisticated operation, but it was very effective, was the breach earlier this year of Snowflake customer instances for the purposes of extortion and data theft. And this all really occurred on the customer side, and it began with a lot of customers and even contractors who had info-stealer malware, in some cases going back several years, that had been surreptitiously installed on their systems. Their credentials had not been rotated for the actual Snowflake instances that they may have been working on or using. And then in a lot of the cases that we responded to as part of this, there was no MFA turned on. So very poor security hygiene for a lot of these organizations. But again, the story really begins with info-stealer malware, and not even info-stealer malware on corporate networks, but on personal devices. One of the other things I had mentioned was the continued rise of 0 days. This is unfortunately something that directionally seems to keep going up. So far this year, the pace seems to have slowed a little bit, but certainly elevated than what we saw prior to 2021. In particular, we were seeing a focus on threat actors looking to target edge infrastructure, VPNs, routers, email gateways, and use that as a jumping off point into the rest of the network. But there's more to the story. So it's not just that we're seeing in totality more 0 days, but we're also seeing a shift by the threat actors to target more products and devices. So threat actors looking for vulnerabilities in a wider array of products, a wider array of devices. We see an increased focus on going after third-party components, open source libraries that are then rolled into these larger enterprise products. So the threat actor logic is, well, if I can find a vulnerability in this open source library, and that's leveraged in maybe 3 different products, that same vulnerability I can potentially leverage for a much wider array of targeting. And so again, if you have to think about patch prioritization, that sort of changes the landscape when there's now potentially more products being targeted. And then another piece of this, which is I think it's a double-edged sword, because I think we're living in an era now where threat intel companies like ours, security researchers, other vendors, they're putting out more information, more research, more blogs into the open source. So the amount of open source intelligence that exists, if you're an organization that you can leverage, is much greater than ever before. But the sort of double-edged sword to that is that it can create this environment where there's a tremendous amount of noise, there's a tremendous amount of varied discussion around threats, And without the ability to prioritize those threats and say, okay, because of the sector that I'm in, the region that I'm in, the partners and businesses that I work with, these are the threats that matter most to me. Without that capability, it can lead to alert fatigue, right? And you have the whole entire environment and landscape to worry about versus being focused in and using threat intelligence to help do that. So moving away from the activity to the actual actors themselves, right? What's the complexity there? Well, I think it takes a number of different forms. The term APT, or Advanced Persistent Threat, we've long used across the industry to refer to more nation-state threats. But really what we see now from a lot of the criminal actors is that they possess a capability that is on par with many, and even in some cases surpasses what we see with nation-state groups. That's been the case for some time. Increasingly, though, what I think we're witnessing is the blurring of lines between these different areas of motivations. So nation-state actors might leverage a criminal who's doing initial access work, providing that access to often groups doing ransomware extortion. Well, they can go purchase that access themselves if that threat actor is openly selling it in the underground. And they may have interest in going after those same targets. Nation-state actors might also, and this is something we've seen especially the last 2 years, they may have interest in posing as a hacktivist or posing as some sort of ideologically motivated individual. And so in the course of their operations, they're interested not just in stealing information, but potentially leaking that out for some sort of larger political end goal, and creating or working with hacktivists as a way to help do that, putting that out on a Telegram channel. And so we've seen this, and we see these sort of situations where this sort of lines blur, and when you're focused on attribution and trying to understand, okay, this is one distinct threat actor, this is a threat actor that maybe they're working with or borrowing infrastructure from, this is one that they seem to be cooperating with in sort of the information operations space, it becomes much more difficult to parse that out. And I think there's also some examples. I go back to that statement I said at the beginning about a greater focus of threat actors to evade detection. What's one of the ways that looks like from an infrastructure standpoint? Well, this is from a set of analysis that we did and put out on our blog related to what we refer to as an ORB network, or Operational Relay Box Network. And it was a set of cyber espionage activity that a range of threat actors were taking that were leveraging this sort of complex array of infrastructure to funnel traffic back and forth between their target and their command and control. Network structure analysis has always been a key component for attribution, but in a situation like this, where the infrastructure is much more complex, in some cases these are compromised devices, in some cases these are provisioned, they're purchased, and in this particular case, where we see, after much research, potentially multiple groups using that same set of infrastructure, it becomes a lot more challenging to do more in-depth attribution as to the relationship of these groups. And so how we used to do attribution for some of these problem sets has to now change going forward in the future because of the care and attention in the way that threat actors are utilizing and shifting their tactics with respect to infrastructure. I think anytime you're talking about cyber threats, again, it's easy to kind of, from a threat intelligence standpoint, talk about how scary, or in this case, complex they're becoming. But I think it would be remiss if I didn't end with a more positive note, or at least something that could be useful to kind of guide organizations if we are in this environment now where the threat activity is shifting, and is shifting dramatically from what we've seen in the past. If it's becoming more complex, what do we do about that? How do we change how we approach and mitigate some of these threats in this sort of changing environment? So first I would say focus on mitigating the initial intrusion vectors, right? Those initial ways threat actors are breaking in from the threat actors that are specifically targeting you. And again, as someone who's in cyber threat intelligence, my answer is going to be more biased to that, but this is really where that can help by forming a cyber threat profile for your organization and say, these are the threat actors that are most likely or were most at risk from being targeted. These are the particular techniques that they are using to break into organizations like ours. Maybe they're using more exploits, maybe they tend to rely more on stolen credentials, but focus on those kind of first to begin with. A specific component of this I'll mention also is patch prioritization, right? So you have many different vulnerabilities that come out. Which ones do you focus on? Again, focusing on the threat actors that matter most to you, and then the specific vulnerabilities that they are exploiting in the wild. Multi-factor authentication. Again, this is something that especially this year we're seeing a lot of stolen credentials being employed in a wide array of attacks. And one of the also notable shifts I would say this past year or so is more threat actors employing more advanced phishing techniques that gets around some forms of MFA. So having MFA, especially for especially important accounts, around that's really central, right? Make that harder to collect and capture. And then maintaining proper logs. This is useful both on the detection side, but then also response. So when you're dealing with a compromised, piece of infrastructure, having logs that you're able to kind of trace that back as patient zero and know where the infection came from, that's crucial. And then lastly, I'll end here, but I think it's also important to think about the non-technical components of breach response. So in dealing with some of these threats, especially of the sort of public extortion kind, as we're seeing data theft being used to target organizations and potentially publicly embarrass them, components of the breach response that are non-technical in nature, things like communication, right? And that could be communication with employees, customers, regulators. That becomes incredibly central to part of the response. So it's not just the technical remediation that matters, but having a game plan in place for dealing with how you are going to address these threats if they become public is an important part of this response kind of focus. So with that, hopefully, it gives you some ways to think about how the world that we are seeing today in the cyber threat environment is actually changing, in some ways becoming more complex, both with the activity we're seeing, with the blurring of lines between threat actors, but then also some ways that, again, a lot of these go back to sort of best practices. We can stay a step ahead in a fast-changing world. Thank you for your time today.